The sharp wind blew through the silent streets of the city as Father Miguel walked toward the archdiocese. His black overcoat fluttered, and the clerical collar tightened around his throat, as if anticipating the weight of the mission he was about to receive. The night was darker than usual, and the clouds hid the moon, making the atmosphere even more oppressive. As he walked through the solid wood doors of the century-old building, he was greeted by a heavy silence. The bishop was waiting in his office, an austere room lit only by the flickering light of a candle. The smell of incense permeated the air, mixed with a faint odor of old books. On the table, a thick dossier lay like an inevitable sentence. "Father Miguel, thank you for coming so quickly," the bishop said, his voice deep and slow. Miguel only nodded. He had faced forces beyond human comprehension before, but something in the bishop's gaze made him sense that this mission was different. The old cleric's gaze was filled with concern and a weariness that seemed to weigh on his soul. The bishop slid the file across the table. "The Church of St. Helena. Have you ever heard of it?" he asked. The priest frowned, trying to remember. "I know it was closed over 50 years ago. Some stories circulate, but nothing concrete." The bishop sighed, passing his hand over his eyes, as if trying to dispel a persistent nightmare. "It wasn't just closed, Father. It was abandoned and sealed. The adjoining convent housed an order of devout nuns, but something happened inside, something that the Vatican preferred to bury in oblivion." Miguel felt a chill run down his spine. He knew well the power of the church to hide dangerous truths. The bishop continued, "There have been recent reports. People say they hear whispers, feel presences. Some young people went in there on a dare and disappeared. We found only one of them, in a catatonic state. He was mumbling nonsense, and on his skin there were marks." Miguel opened the file and saw disturbing photographs. Walls covered in symbols carved with fingernails, benches torn apart as if claws had torn them apart, stained glass windows stained with a dark liquid. In the last photo, the most disturbing was the young survivor. His skin was streaked with inverted religious symbols, and his eyes, empty, completely black. The priest closed the file and swallowed hard. "And what exactly do you expect me to do?" The bishop leaned forward, the candlelight flickering over his face. "Go there, find out what's left, and if necessary, expel what's still inside." The road that led to the Church of Santa Helena was winding, cutting through a dense forest that seemed to swallow the light of the headlights. Miguel's car moved slowly over the dirt, its tires sinking slightly into the fresh mud. The radio didn't pick up a signal, and the silence became an uncomfortable companion. As he got closer, the priest began to feel an inexplicable weight on his chest. It wasn't just anxiety. It was as if something invisible was pressing down on his body, trying to dissuade him. The trees around him seemed more twisted, their shadows forming figures that his mind insisted on transforming into human silhouettes. At a certain point, something crossed the road. Miguel stepped on the brakes, the car skidding slightly before stopping. The headlights illuminated the figure, a thin, sick deer, its skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Its eyes reflected an unnatural glow, and its breathing was heavy and irregular. For a moment, Miguel felt the animal staring at him, not instinctively but consciously, as if it recognized his presence. The deer slowly turned and disappeared into the darkness. When he finally reached the church, the sight left him breathless. Time had claimed the place. The walls were covered in twisted ivy, as if they were hungry hands trying to swallow the structure. The once colorful stained glass windows were shattered, leaving only empty frames. The large, weather-beaten oak door creaked with an almost painful sound as he pushed it open. As he stepped through the doorway, he felt absolute silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was an emptiness, an oppressive nothingness that made each of his steps a sacrilege. The wooden pews were covered in dust and soot. The altar, made of white marble, was now stained with something dark, almost black. Then he felt it, a gaze, coming from the convent attached to the church. Miguel turned slowly. The door to the convent was ajar, dark as the mouth of a predator on the prowl. The air around it seemed thicker, charged with something ancient and profane. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial of holy water. He made the sign of the cross, muttering a prayer. Then the sound, a faint scratching coming from inside the convent. Something, or someone, was still there. The convent's corridors were narrow and suffocating. The old walls, once adorned with sacred images, were now stained and covered in cracks. Each step Miguel took made a hollow sound, as if the floor itself were hesitant to support him. The air smelled of mold and melted wax, as if candles still burned somewhere hidden. He ran his fingers over the walls, feeling the cold dampness. The shadows lengthened, dancing with the weak light of his lantern. He followed a corridor that led to the convent's old library. The doors were ajar, revealing a dusty room filled with shelves crammed with leather books worn by time. It was there that he found a book unlike the others, a diary. The cover, made of dried leather, displayed engraved symbols that he could not immediately recognize. When he opened it, he noticed that the pages were stained, some with something that looked like blood. The author's name was blacked out, but the content was undeniably terrifying. The words written in the diary were an invitation to insanity. Miguel read each sentence with growing horror, his breath coming in short gasps. The nuns who had lived in the convent had recorded in detail the events that preceded its demise. Their accounts spoke of visions, voices, and orders from what they called beyond the veil. The blood cries out for penance. The voices come in the night and command us to open the gates. They say we are trapped here, that the true God has been imprisoned. We must free him before it is too late. With each page he turned, Miguel saw the pattern unfold. First came the whispered voices. Then the nuns began to have collective dreams, visions of a being imprisoned in a dark and endless place. Then came the first strange marks on the convent walls, carved by hands unseen. He reached the last pages. The final account was a desperate confession. We have opened the portal. The world is not prepared for what we have seen. Now we are cursed. May God forgive us. A chill ran down the priest's spine. Slamming the journal shut, he realized that he had to find that portal. If it really existed, perhaps it was still there, hidden in the confines of the convent. The basement. The idea came like a whisper to his mind. He picked up the flashlight, tucked the journal under his arm, and walked through the convent. The air seemed heavier now, charged with a pulsing energy. He found a stone staircase that led downward to a subterranean place forgotten by time. The sour, metallic smell filled his nostrils as he descended the first step. The walls were made of damp stone, covered in moss and dark stains. The sound of falling drops echoed through the narrow corridor, but there was something else. A low, steady hum, like a distant choir whispering. And then he saw it. A reinforced wooden door, marked by deep scratches and inverted religious symbols. The latch was rusted, but the door felt alive. Miguel swallowed hard and pushed. The chill that ran through his body was unnatural. It was as if he had crossed an invisible threshold. Inside the underground chamber, a circle of black stone was embedded in the floor. In the center was a deep, dark hole. It was no ordinary hole. It consumed the light around it, like a hungry abyss. Miguel approached slowly. A shiver ran down his spine as he realized something was creeping into his mind, a silent call from the depths. It was then that he heard it, a faint, almost human laugh. And a nun, dead for decades, opened her eyes and whispered, "You opened your eyes too late." The nun's presence was impossible. Her body rose from a dark corner of the room, her eyes sunken and empty, as if every trace of her soul had been drained long ago. Her habit was torn, covered in dark stains that gave off a putrid odor. Miguel instinctively recoiled, his hand clutching the vial of holy water in his pocket. She smiled, an inhuman smile, too wide for a human face. Her lips stretched up to her cheeks, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. The skin on her face began to crack, like a porcelain mask cracking from the inside. And then, without moving her lips, her voice echoed directly into Miguel's mind. "You came too late, Father." The black hole in the center of the room began to emit a guttural sound, as if something was awakening from a deep, unnatural sleep. Miguel felt his body being pulled by an invisible force, his feet sliding across the floor, covered in demonic symbols. The chill in the air intensified, and he realized that he was not just facing a spirit. It was something more, something much worse. The nun stepped forward, her head drooping grotesquely, like a corpse hanging by invisible threads. Miguel tried to remember his prayers, but his mind was fragmented with fear. His faith, which had always sustained him, flickered like the flame of a candle about to go out. A hand emerged from the depths of the hole, long, skeletal, with gnarled fingers and skin as black as the deepest night. The nails were claws, and the knuckles looked gaunt, as if they had been burned by a fire that had never been extinguished. Miguel gripped his crucifix tightly, but the metal was as cold as ice. And then, the voice from the abyss whispered his name. Block 5, the whisper of the abyss. The sound was soft at first, almost like a distant whisper, but it soon took shape, filling the entire room with a crushing pressure. Miguel felt the air become thick, heavy, as if each breath was a struggle against an invisible force that squeezed him from within. His eyes widened, trying to find an explanation for what was happening. But the scene before him was beyond any human comprehension. The hand that had emerged from the black hole was now reaching out towards him, as if it was searching for something vital, something essential. The cold was unbearable, and he could barely support its weight. His faith, which had always given him strength, seemed to disintegrate before that presence, like a golden thread being burned by fire. "You cannot escape," the voice resounded again, and this time it was not just a whisper. It was a command, a statement that made the earth beneath his feet tremble. Miguel tried to retreat, but the ground seemed to crumble beneath him. Each step he took was like walking through quicksand. The walls of the room, once shadowy, now seemed to distort, twisting into grotesque shapes that merged with the demonic symbols on the floor. The nun, or what was left of her, continued to move slowly, her empty eyes now fixed on Miguel with a disturbing fixity. "You are so close, Father," she murmured, her voice now blending with the sound of the abyss. "So close, and yet so far." Miguel closed his eyes, clutching the crucifix with all his remaining strength. He remembered the words of Christ, the promises of victory over the darkness, but his mind was suffocated by the evil presence surrounding him. The air was thick with a sense of despair, as if the very words of God were distant and almost unreal. The black hole in the room opened even wider, becoming a portal to a place without light, where hope seemed to have been consumed completely. He felt a pressure on his mind, as if he were being dragged into that darkness. It was the abyss, the very essence of loss and pain. But deep within him, Miguel felt something still burning, a spark of resistance, a reminder of his mission. He could not succumb, not now. And with a last breath of faith, he raised the vial of holy water toward the abyss, whispering a prayer that he almost did not recognize as his own. "In the name of Christ, I command you to retreat. In the name of Christ, I command the darkness to flee." The room shook. The nun, or whatever she was, writhed with an expression of fury. The black hole began to slowly close, but the claws of the skeletal hand still approached, and the whisper of the abyss grew louder, trying to take over his thoughts. But Miguel did not give up. He kept praying, even as his mind wavered, even as his vision blurred. He knew there was a battle going on, a battle that was not just his, but everyone who still believed, even as the darkness tried to swallow the last flame of faith. The abyss, was not unbeatable, and he, Michael, was not alone. The pressure on Miguel intensified, as if the abyss itself were trying to swallow him. The skeletal hand reached out towards him, its gnarled fingers almost touching his face. The frigid air cut into his skin, and he felt every fiber of his being pulled into the darkness. The nun, now a shadow of herself, laughed softly, a hissing laugh that echoed off the walls, reverberating in the deepest corners of the room. But Miguel did not stop. His eyes opened, shining with an intensity he had not known he possessed. He felt something inside him ignite, an invisible flame that became a burning flame of faith. The words he spoke were no longer just prayers, but a desperate cry for salvation, a cry of resistance against the black tide of evil that tried to engulf him. "I am the light of the world," he said, his voice firm, echoing in the room. "And light cannot be overcome by darkness." With the last breath of her prayer, the vial of holy water in her hand lit up, glowing with a golden light that radiated to every corner of the room. The skeletal hand, about to touch it, pulled away, as if burned by the light. The nun, with her empty eyes and distorted expression, let out an inhuman scream, a mixture of pain and rage, but the sound was soon muffled by the intensifying light. The black hole that had opened in the center of the room began to tremble, its edges rippling, as if it were being consumed by something greater. The walls, previously deformed, straightened, and the demonic symbols on the floor began to disintegrate, disappearing like ashes in the wind. The evil presence that dominated the room began to dissipate, shredded by the light emanating from Miguel, and the weight on his chest eased. He felt a gentle warmth taking over his body, the energy of his faith transforming into visible and tangible strength. The nun collapsed to the floor, her body slowly disintegrating, as if she were being erased by the power of the light that now filled the room. The black hole, which had once seemed like a portal to the depths, finally closed, disappearing without a trace. Michael fell to his knees, exhausted, but with his heart pounding. He looked around, the space now in absolute silence. The darkness had been driven away, and the light he had summoned was the last thing that remained. He felt that something inside him had changed, something that made him stronger than any evil that tried to rise against him. The air was fresh now, and the demonic symbols on the floor had disappeared. The room, once corrupted, was clean and restored. Michael looked at the crucifix he still held tightly. It was warm, as if it had been rekindled by the power of his prayer. Michael knew that the battle was not completely won. He knew that more dark abysses could arise, more temptations could arise. But he also knew, with absolute certainty, that the light would never cease to shine, even in the darkest moments. He rose with difficulty, but with new determination, sensing the presence of something much greater than himself, something that would guide him. And with that, he left the room, leaving behind not only the shadows, but also the echo of Christ's words that had always sustained him. "I am with you always, to the end of the age." The end